HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Season, A Social History of the Debutante, by Kristen Richardson, read by Cassandra Campbell. They dream in courtship, but in wedlock wake. Alexander Pope. Introduction. Too Many Daughters. The debutante ritual flourished roughly from 1780 to 1914, beginning with the first debutante ball in London and ending with the outbreak of World War I. In this period, the debutante season functioned as it was intended to, allowing parents to broker their daughters' marriages in the way that benefited them most. During these years, Great Britain became the dominant power in the West, and its culture spread outward from the fashionable capital of London to provincial cities in Britain and eventually to its far-flung colonies. His Majesty's British subjects, and later Americans too, waited on coral atolls and in bustling port cities for ships that brought newspapers filled with word of fashionable music, dance, and conversation. Daughters had their seamstresses copy dresses they saw, adapting them to climates with Spanish moss and pink sand, or icy winters and salty air. In the outlying areas of England and America alike, one would encounter not only glamorous debutantes, but also their aspirant little sisters. Some were daughters of aristocrats, some were heiresses to bourgeois fortunes, and more still were simply members of families with some money who had become, at last, respectable people in their small towns. Even the daughters of an innkeeper at a ferry on the Shenandoah walked for 7 miles 3 times a week to attend the lessons with a French dancing master who taught them to trace the same quadrilles danced by aristocrats in distant foreign courts. These young women, who were presented to monarchs, who were betrothed to waning aristocrats, or whose fathers scrounged for money so they could walk across a stage and curtsy to a small-town mayor or rodeo clown, were united by an irresolvable dilemma. The only respectable career for women was marriage, and the best marriages were made by debutantes. The debutantes we think of today, bowing deeply in frosty dresses, originated and evolved in England and America quite simply because they were needed to solve a problem. The Protestant Reformation in 16th century England and Northern Europe ended the extremely convenient practice of cloistering unmarriageable girls in convents. While Catholic aristocracy in Europe continued this practice, the English aristocracy now had a daughter problem. Protestants, you see, don't have convents. When an exasperated Mr. Bennet says of his 5 daughters in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, "What's to be done with all these girls?" he was speaking to a marriage problem that had existed, unresolved, for several hundred years already. The Reformation left wealthy or titled Englishmen with a glut of daughters, whose marriages had to be considered most delicately, since, by law, they could not inherit their fathers' estates. The type of marriage the debutante ritual would provide was safe. The girls were presented to vetted company, and prevented a bad marriage from dragging down the status of an entire family, like Lydia's threatened to do in Austen's novel. The Reformation was not the only factor in the development of debutante culture. The Dutch, for example, underwent the Reformation, but lacked an active, powerful aristocracy. They had had a strong and integrated middle class of burghers, and did not need to control and arrange marriages in a court setting to perpetuate an aristocratic caste. To understand how and why the ritual developed specifically in England and its colonies requires considering to what extent the marriage market was indeed a market, born, not coincidentally, during England's long, slow industrialization. England experienced commercialization earlier than did other countries, due in large part to the social upheaval that followed the Reformation. Free market experimentation was destabilizing and changed the way people thought and behaved, replacing guaranteed income from inherited land with the boundless possibility of new speculative ventures. Freer markets, however, created insecurity and uncertainty where little had previously existed. Men quitted their villages and traveled in search of jobs, leaving the English countryside dotted with upper-middle-class girls with no source of respectable income, like Austen's Bennets. The Bennet girls couldn't marry the men who stayed in the country. They were small farmers. But neither did they really have access to the elite stratum in London. They were respectable, not fashionable, genteel, not noble, and were therefore left only to hope that a partner who would meet with approval might find them, and would see something in their country freshness. Mrs. Bennet is aware of this and seeks to put them in every good light she can, often looking ridiculous in the process. Given the context of near-impossible marriage prospects, one can suddenly sympathize with Mrs. Bennet's delight when Mr. Bingley arrives in town and brings his friend Mr. Darcy to the local assembly. Greater economic mobility and freedom created a social insecurity that played particular havoc with society's most pleasing commodity, young women, who etched their conflicted feelings about their debutante experiences into countless diaries and letters. Some participated but resented newcomers and competition. Some crouched in corners and hid from the throngs. Sometimes a young woman bloomed and performed well under inspection, convincing herself, perhaps, that she had some choice in a process that might fashion her salvation or downfall, all of which begs the question, if we are indeed trapped, should we try to enjoy it? What does it feel like to be a debutante? Numerous journals and letters suggest conclusions far less varied than I anticipated, perhaps because the disenchanted are more enthusiastic about writing their recollections. In the early years of debutante presentation, there was less dissent, but as options for women grew, women became more conflicted about what a debutante presentation meant, and more aware of their status as objects or pawns within a larger schematic process. Some women felt as Edith Wharton did, describing her season as a long, cold agony of shyness. Eleanor Roosevelt hated her debut, which she made at the White House alongside her more glamorous cousin Alice, daughter of then-President Theodore Roosevelt. Eleanor then came out at a larger assembly ball in New York, an event she described similarly as Wharton did an utter agony. But in her memoirs, she also recalls how deeply important it had been to her beautiful mother Anna, who died when she was a child, that she also be a debutante. Those who enjoyed the process were happy to have their names peppered throughout gossip columns and in fashion magazines. Some kept journals listing their conquests. Brenda Fraser, the most famous debutante of the 20th century, whose face sold cars and perfumes, claimed in a 1963 Life magazine article that her mother had forced her into the limelight at 17 and said, "I was a fad that year, the way midget golf was once a fad, or flagpole sitting." And there are, too, innumerable nameless girls who went through this process, whose only legacy is their debutante scrapbook, a record of press clippings and photos of fellow debutantes. These scrapbooks are generally found at the tail end of family archives, where one first must riffle through the recorded deeds of great and accomplished tycoons, politicians, and landowners. Even though these daughters played a vital role in the transmission of their father's power, their lives remain obscure. It is ironic, then, that the season was the only chance a debutante would have to experience even the barest hint of control over her own body and mind. The transitional space between her parents' house and her husband's was the freest she would likely ever be. At a party, this might mean noting the texture of champagne sliding down her throat, or the restraint of a corset, or the pain from her beautiful shoes. She would hear the din of an orchestra, the buzz of the lights, whispers in corners, murmurs of assent, reluctant demurrals. She would smell the heavy scent of flower arrangements, the deep, humid smoke of cigars, and the dryness of cigarettes. The terror of everyone focusing on her, the tightness of her hair, the immobility of her smile, the boredom of civic responsibility. When I was 17, a woman phoned my mother and asked her if I wanted to be a debutante. I was home from boarding school for the summer, and we were standing in the kitchen of our house in Connecticut. My mother put the phone on the counter and asked me, and I laughed and curtsied and shook my head. My mother told the woman, "No, thank you," and we went on with our day. That I was invited by phone, and so casually, might seem at odds with what people generally think about the debutante ritual, with its formality and frothy rigor, but at our house we received a steady stream of phone calls from strangers bearing invitations. My father rarely answered the phone at all, but particularly not in the evening, when the social calls would begin, when the women would begin to call. These women had been, in their younger years, facsimiles of Ally McGraw, attending women's colleges, toying with protest, perhaps even voting for McGovern, but had long since settled into pastel colors. Bobbed and headbanded, in the evening hours they spoke on corded phones that stretched around the narrow doorways of colonial houses as they worked to organize their lives, which revolved around their children, with their lessons in dance, golf, tennis, sailing, music, and riding. The world of my childhood was fueled by such calls, and by a web of invitations between members of the same tribe. Yacht club people, hunt club people, country club people. We were, at various times, all three. Would my brother and I be going to dancing school? Yes, for both of us. To sailing lessons? Yes, for him. To riding camp? Yes, for me. My father did all those things, and we would too, at the same places. I didn't receive an invitation to debut because I was pretty, or smart, or charming. The invitation was an entreaty to contribute to the community as much as it was a service rendered unto me, the teenager. We would lend our family name to the festivities, and I would emerge from my chrysalis ready to carry the values I was meant to embody into the wider world. A kind of upper-class mascot. Right before I was set to go to college, to leave the privileged, interconnected world I grew up in, I was being called on to affirm that I would stay. I couldn't do it. At 17, I was shy and had no interest in being on display. To embrace an open show of wealth ran contrary to everything I had been taught or had passively absorbed about how to behave. I was not yet aware that the people around me, girls and their families, were attempting to purchase their social legitimacy for the same reasons my ancestors had purchased theirs years before, so their children didn't have to. My friends who did make a debut mostly did so to appease their mothers and grandmothers. Even if my mother, who is from a middle-class Irish Catholic background, had been invested in my making my debut, she could not have forced me to come out without the imprimatur of my father's family. They were the ones with the social credentials, though worn reluctantly and awkwardly. Nobody in my father's family had ever taken any interest in my social education, but I was put in the places where I would acquire the desired attitude and correct education. Once there, I was mostly left alone to learn how to behave on my own via absorption. My paternal grandmother, who traditionally would have taken the leading role in my coming out, loathed anything pretentious. One of her own daughters had been brought out by my grandfather's sister, my great-aunt, a former debutante whose ball in Manhattan had been attended by a chorus of blue bloods, as well as the ornamental minor aristocracy who often turn up to lend the necessary gravitas to American social events. But my grandmother was from a Navy family, and any debut she might have made, none is my guess, was squashed by the Second World War, during which she drove a taxi in Newport. It seemed to me she continued to operate her life in this same directional way for as long as I knew her. She loved art and had beautiful taste, but was suspicious of all fanfare, She eschewed logos and told us that we are not anyone's advertisement. When I was left in her care, she would entertain me by handing me a wooden pail of sailing knots to untie with my tiny fingers. When at 6, I wove myself between warp and weft of her large loom that had its own room on the 4th floor of their house. I was relieved to be found and unraveled by my grandparents' housekeeper, who laughed and warned me to never, ever do that again. The notion of the two of us lovingly perusing scrapbooks filled with old social news or bonding over the tool explosion that would be my debutante's dress makes me laugh to think of it. But many women in my family have been debutantes. I have this information because my great-grandfather, a North Carolina industrialist who had married a Virginian belle from an old family, paid several genealogists to construct a lineage for us. The book they produced is 400 pages long and traces his family back to 13th century England and France and 17th century British America, and places us among the colonial elite, spending much more time on our ancestor who owned much of Williamsburg and the other who was an explorer than on the many more who were pig farmers in Virginia and the Carolinas. From this book, I learn that a debutante ancestor captivated a young George Washington, who sent her several short letters of admiration, mimeographed into the book, of course. A second book, also written by genealogists, traces my great-grandmother's ancestry. Her history was more direct than his. Her family was old and connected, and there was nothing to invent. Her ancestors weren't indentured servants sent to Jamestown, but King James's men, who arrived on the second boat, the money boat. Having been granted thousands of acres land by the king instead of the money they'd put into the Virginia Company, a failure, her ancestors arrived to colonize what is now colonial Williamsburg. They intermarried with other similar families and began an unbroken chain of daughters who acted as vessels for their father's property, allowing the family to make key alliances that have sustained us, through ups and downs, for the 4 centuries we have been in America. When I was a senior at boarding school, remembering these books in our library, I cannily chose family history to be my independent study project, written over a semester, which I could use to get out of playing on the tennis team. It took me only a matter of days to rewrite what the jazz-age genealogists had turned up. I used my newly free time to lie flat in the tall grass behind the soccer fields, reading and sending thin wreaths of smoke into the air. At the end of the semester, my teachers were astonished at the depth of the history I had unearthed. These illustrious and often tenuous connections to seemingly refined historical predecessors serve to set my family into history, to validate our contemporary place, and to let me, an entitled teenager, sit back and coast, as I did with my family history project. This is the function the debutante ritual serves, and has served for the families who decide to pursue it. It's like a good cleanse. Whatever grime covered the climb to the top, a white dress and a good party will hide a multitude of sins. After deciding not to make a debut myself, I didn't give my decision much thought. I went to college in North Carolina, a nod to my family's southern roots. Over the Christmas holidays, I attended some of my prep school friends' coming-out parties in New York. A few of the friends I had made in college flew home to make furtive debuts, but there was no fanfare at school. There remained an unarticulated sense that this was something to be endured but not discussed, a favor to one's family, a duty. At the beginning of the George W. Bush presidency, with its resurgent conservatism, lavish parties came back into style. I started to understand what my father had felt during the evening. Don't answer the phone, go to bed early, read books, walk dogs. I stopped going to these parties quickly, but many of my friends stayed in that scene. using their social lives to advance their own careers in fashion, magazines, publicity, and business. I was particularly interested to see that the debutante scene, nearly rendered extinct by 90s grunge, was booming once again in the new millennium. My more distant younger Southern cousins began to come out, one by one, at various debutante presentations in the Carolinas. As the debutante ritual gained traction once again, I wondered how it would align with the changing values of a 20th century upper class, a group led less by WASPs and minor aristocrats, and more by tech billionaires, Wall Street money men, and entertainment industry superstars whose wealth and reach eclipsed anything since the Gilded Age. What had felt arcane to me was clearly relevant to my young cousins, who lived in the banking centers of the New South, their status still a trump card and parameter of exclusion. But I didn't see their young male counterparts embarking on revived 18th century-style grand tours. I wanted to know why the social advancement of families seemed only to happen through young women. Since it became institutionalized in the late 18th century, the debutante ritual has been unkillable. Though there is a moment at every debutante party when an elderly relative sounds a dirge for the passing of the age of debutantes, it is not a ritual in mellow decline, but one that is completely bulletproof. Its very outmodedness is part of its value. Its built-in nostalgia is fundamentally necessary to its continuation. With each successive generation, this nostalgia further fogs the ritual's mercenary origins in a mist of glamour, so much so that when I asked debutantes at a recent ball in Manhattan where and how it began, not a single one could answer my question, and none was interested in trying either. We learn early that it is better not to look too closely when money and status are at stake, a message I received as well. When I began to mention this book to members of my father's family, it quickly became clear to me that seeing this project through wouldn't be breezy conversations at the club or drinks on the terrace. Some of my relatives pushed back against my work with social warnings like, "Now make sure you don't say anything mean, and don't say anything arch now." The more people tried to corral me into a soothing and uncomplicated world view, the more I wondered if they knew in their hearts, too, that this isn't something we should do to girls. At the same time, their defensiveness spoke to something that bothered me. Criticisms of the debutante ritual are most commonly aimed at the young women themselves, who bear a certain burden for being standard-bearers of upper-class values when they are barely adults themselves. But my research revealed that the debutante ritual is far more complex and interesting than I could have anticipated. It took time for the barter of daughters to acquire an agreeable sheen, for the debutante ritual to become so beautiful and exclusive that girls themselves began to crave participation. The debutante ritual was so effective a social climbing tool that parents jockeyed over presentation venues. It was so costly that it created new industries for its supporting staff. It launched the careers of fashionable dressmakers, hairdressers, makeup artists, designers, florists, and dancing masters. It created markets for women's magazines and gazettes that were the prototype of today's fashion magazines. It provided steady work for painters, photographers, and musicians, and for the social secretaries who were the forerunners of publicists, the gatekeepers of today's social scene. The debutante ritual created a soft economy wherein people with knowledge and family history but no money could earn a living as guardians of ancient social rules. Crucially, there were roles for mothers, widows, and maiden aunts as chaperones. Wealthy gay men, the committed bachelors, became walkers and arbiters. The more indispensable they were to women, the safer they were in a hostile patriarchal social environment. All of these people worked in service of a system they could participate in only as long as their social knowledge remained both current and vibrant. It was competitive, stressful, and unstable, requiring both ongoing vigilance and a precise balance between conformity and innovation. Today's social life still follows the rhythm of the debutante season, and its focus remains money. Fathers didn't only advance through their daughters, they figured out how to make them beg for the right to curtsy. Because of its primal link to coming-of-age rituals and its success at advancing the social status of its participants, the debutante ritual has been adopted by numerous and varied cultures, who have alternately democratized it or ruined it, depending on whom you ask. The ritual was a main driver of upper-class marriage in Britain and the United States for several hundred years, but it has never been taken seriously by scholars. When I began to look into the ritual's origins, I was surprised they were so difficult to pinpoint. Historians have been content to describe when it began, but have been uninterested in dealing with why. Elitist rituals are easy to dismiss, and when they shape young women's lives, it's easier still. But if we do so, we miss a key part of women's history, and the history of marriage as well. Chapter 1. The Girl Standard. Understanding the Currency of Daughters. Young women have always been for sale. In the 5th century BCE, Herodotus describes the practice of selling Babylonian daughters at a yearly auction in his histories. He wrote, "They used to collect all the young women who were old enough to be married and take the whole lot of them all at once to a certain place. A crowd of men would form a circle around them there. An auctioneer would get each of the women to stand up one by one, and he would put her up for sale. He used to start with the most attractive girl there, and then, once she had fetched a good price and been bought, he would go on to auction the next most attractive one. They were being sold to be wives, not slaves. All the well-off Babylonian men who wanted wives would outbid one another to buy the good-looking young women, while the commoners who wanted wives and were not interested in good looks used to end up with some money as well as the less attractive women." The Babylonian men paid a bride price, but some of their money would come back to them because the young women were given dowries, which their husbands would administer even if they could not rate it. This exchange seems odd, but was not so unusual in the classical world, where women served to cement together two male-controlled families. If a married daughter died without children, her money would go back to her family, which removed any incentive to harm her. At the time, virginity was not always necessary to a girl's successful marriage. The Lydians prostituted their daughters to raise money for their dowries. Because of the dangers of childbirth and high rate of early mortality in ancient Greece, it was common for wealthy relatives to provide not just their daughters, but also their poor relations with dowries. Athenian law even required that the state dower poor women of just passable attractiveness. Teeth were all that were required. Because Athens was under constant threat from its rivals, it depended on its young women to provide it with a constant stream of new soldiers. Classical literature is filled with accounts of creative daughter disposal. In some memorable verses of the Odyssey, the father of Penelope, Odysseus's wife, then thought to be a widow, urges her to marry the suitor with the most gifts. Greek fathers took care not to raise more daughters than they could dower. Outright infanticide was abhorrent to ancient Greeks, but they did practice exposure, wherein parents intentionally left unwanted infants exposed to the elements. They believed that the gods could choose to save the abandoned children, thereby eliminating their agency while achieving their aims. Husbands were not permitted to run through their wives' dowries, but neither could a wife. A Greek woman's dowry yielded about 18% per year, and if the couple got divorced, either party could request the dowry. It was returned to a woman's guardian, or in certain cases, kept by the husband who paid 18% interest to his former wife's guardian for her support. The wealthier the family, the more likely it was that a marriage would take.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?